Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club. We're happy to have our guest speaker today. He's the president of the World Bank Group, Mr. Yong Kim. He's in Tokyo ahead of the World Disaster Conference that's starting up in Sendai this week. And I won't go through his all of his long and extensive background. But he became the 12th president of the World Bank in 2012 after having served as president of Dartmouth College. Let's see, he's in the club. He will be talking today about the bank's role in disaster risk management, building resiliency, and pandemic response. As some of you know, that after disasters and during disasters, those with the least often have the most to lose and the greatest difficulty in getting back on their feet. Dr. Kim is a physician and an anthropologist and is co-founder of Partners in Health and a former director of the HIV/AIDS department at the WHO. He was born in 1959 in Seoul, and his family moved to the U.S. at the age of 5, and he grew up in Muscatine, Iowa. Yes, and he graduated with a AB from Brown in 1982 and earned an MD from Harvard Medical School in 91. And then a PhD in anthropology from Harvard in 1993. And anyway, without any further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest speaker today, the president of the World Bank Group, Dr. Yong Kim.
Is there a podium? The bring in the podium? Or? Okay. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Let me start by just talking a little bit about the World Bank Group. For the first time in its history, the World Bank Group has established two goals that shape our mission. The first is to end extreme poverty by 2030, and the second is to boost shared prosperity. To accomplish the first, we aim to lower the percentage of people living in extreme poverty, which we define as living on less than $1.25 per day, to less than 3% within the next 15 years. To accomplish the second goal, we need to ensure that gains from economic growth accrue to the bottom 40% of income earners in developing countries at a level that's higher when compared with the overall national growth rate. We now know that the only way to reach these goals is to accelerate a kind of economic growth that's more inclusive, socially sustainable, and protects the environment, and that's precisely our plan. These targets are truly ambitious, but how humbling truly it is to know that we're the first generation in human history that can actually end the scourge of extreme poverty in a generation. If we succeed in just 15 years, close to 1 billion people will no longer experience what one of my predecessors, Robert McNamara, called in 1973, quote, a condition of life so degraded by disease, illiteracy, malnutrition, and squalor as to not deny its victims basic human necessities, end quote. I'm in Japan for the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Conference because without better disaster risk management, it will be extremely difficult to accomplish our goals. The government of Japan has shown exceptional leadership in improving disaster risk management around the world by supporting critical work in expanding expert knowledge and by sharing its own expertise with the world. Prime Minister Abe and his cabinet have been the lead partner in this area, and Japan's continued support is essential if we're to help countries prepare for future disasters. We could not be more serious about this issue. Disasters, whether they be geological, meteorological, or biological, tragically result in loss of life and significant reductions in economic growth. Over the past 30 years, the world has lost more than 2.5 million people and almost $4 trillion because of natural disasters. More than 3/4 of these disaster-related deaths are in developing countries, with almost half of them in low-income countries. In 2010, the earthquake in Haiti destroyed the fruits of more than a decade of steady economic growth. In 2013, Typhoon Haiyan pushed nearly 500,000 Filipino households into poverty. In the worst affected areas in the Philippines, poverty rates rose to 56%. And over the past 16 months, the Ebola epidemic has killed nearly 10,000 people in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Let me state clearly about Ebola that we are not done in terms of controlling this epidemic, and the economic, social, and human consequences of this epidemic will continue until we get to 0 cases in each of the countries. In 2015, for example, we estimate that these 3 countries will forfeit $1.6 billion in economic growth because of Ebola. Prior to the start of the epidemic, these 3 countries had some of the highest growth rates in the world, and now their growth rates are expected to be 0 or even negative. The bottom line is that to end poverty, we must continue to expand our understanding of how to manage disasters and deploy this knowledge aggressively. Because of climate change, the frequency, intensity, and duration of extreme climatic events will increase. Thus, the disaster risk posed by droughts, earthquakes, and typhoons will only become worse in the future. Those with much to lose from these developments understand these dangers very well. According to a Towers Watson survey in 2013, 30,000 insurance industry executives identified pandemics, hurricanes, and earthquakes as the sources of risk that they feared the most. And according to this year's Global Risk Report, compiled by the World Economic Forum, environmental threats topped economic risks in the view of CEOs and business leaders. These views are driven largely by our failure to adequately prepare for disaster risk. The World Economic Forum's risk report attributed the CEOs and business leaders' conclusions about risk, in its words, to the marked increase in experts' negative assessment of existing preparations to cope with challenges such as extreme weather and climate change. We at the World Bank Group share this concern and would add that risks and potential damage are even higher in those countries that can least afford it. Over the past 2 decades, the international community committed just under $110 billion to disaster relief, prevention, and preparedness. This is a small sum when you consider that costs related to disaster recovery worldwide now average close to $200 billion every year, with almost 75% of these costs due to weather-related disasters. And only a little more than 10% of disaster aid has funded prevention and preparedness. Compare this to the case in Japan. In Japan, close to 80% of the disaster risk management budget is devoted to preparedness. This is the right thing to do. There's very good reason and rationale behind Japan's focus on doing things before a disaster strikes. It saves lives and money. In the fall of 2013, Cyclone Phelan in India tragically took the lives of 40 people. But a storm the same size in 1999 killed 10,000 people. The difference was that in 2013, the people of India were prepared. A new early warning system and a growing network of cyclone shelters enabled 900,000 people to find a safe haven from the storm. We estimate that every $1 invested in early warning systems can provide as much as $36 in economic benefits because it prevents losses to property and businesses. According to our initial research, by our group and others, neglecting disaster prevention may also cause slower economic growth, undermining the most powerful engine we have for ending poverty. Specifically, inadequate prevention measures can lead to a culture of excessive risk aversion when it comes to investment, especially for people who have previously experienced a disaster. People and businesses simply choose not to put capital at risk. We saw a form of this in the Ebola epidemic. According to our models, Aversion behavior, where people decide not to engage in economic activity in attempts to avoid the risk of exposure to Ebola, has been driving much of the decline in growth in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Based on this knowledge, we're working to refocus developing countries on prevention and preparedness when it comes to disaster risk management. For example, since last July, we've been evaluating the development projects funded through the International Development Association, or IDA, which is our fund for the poorest countries, for exposures to these risks. We've also incorporated this information into the country partnership frameworks which define our work in any given country. This means that going forward, our projects in the poorest and most vulnerable countries will be much better prepared for disasters and climate change. We're also working with partners to reduce developing countries' vulnerability to natural hazards and adapt to climate change. Japan has been an especially good partner in this regard. After the Sendai Dialogue in 2012, we set up a $100 million program to assist countries in managing disaster risks. Run out of Tokyo, this initiative guides countries' national programs, investors' investment strategies, and the World Bank Group's operations. One of the most important steps we can take to prepare for disasters is to ensure the immediate availability of funding, something that, again, Japan knows very, very well. In 2008, a Japanese agricultural cooperative, JA Kyosai, purchased a catastrophic bond from a German reinsurance company, Munich Re, which would pay up to $300 million to the cooperative in the event of certain predefined metrics. After the Great East Japan earthquake of 2011, this instrument became the first catastrophic bond to pay out on the occurrence of a geological event. Japan has been supportive of our efforts to make similar kinds of innovative financing mechanisms available to governments of developing countries. Since 2008, we approved $1.38 billion in contingency loans to help 9 countries secure response funding before disaster strikes. Using capital from Japan, we've also provided financing for the Pacific Catastrophe Insurance Facility, which helped countries in the Pacific Islands secure $43 million of earthquake, tsunami, and tropical cyclone risk insurance coverage in 2014. Given the success of these initiatives, we're examining whether similar approaches could work in crisis situations where financing is absent, such as pandemics. The Ebola crisis shows why this is needed. Once we recognized the severity of the epidemic, we committed more than $500 million very quickly to the governments of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone to help finance the immediate response. But this money only started flowing 8 months after the outbreak. Now, once we declared that we were going to make the money flow, it started flowing from the bank in 9 days. But overall, the first monies for Ebola did not flow until 8 months into the epidemic. This is without question an indictment of the entire global community in that we failed to recognize this epidemic early enough. But we all now must remember this critically important lesson from Ebola. We need to respond much more quickly to the next outbreak. To help do this, we're currently developing the concept of a pandemic emergency facility. Our goal is to work with partners to create a financial instrument that rapidly disperses a large amount of funds within 8 hours, not 8 months, of an outbreak that meets certain objective criteria. The other main goal of the pandemic facility is to promote greater country investments in preparedness, which starts with having strong, resilient health systems. The Ebola crisis lays bare the consequences of inadequate public health capacity, from disease surveillance and laboratory analysis to frontline health services and community health workers. People die, economic growth rates decline, and countries, their neighbors, and the entire world are put at risk. These consequences show why Japan's recent $20 million contribution to support our Ebola recovery efforts is so important. As we take a look at all we've learned from the largest Ebola outbreak in history, we can begin to piece together what a global response capacity that's truly equal to the challenge of even the worst pandemic might look like. It might look like this: rapidly dispersing financial mechanisms, strong global technical coordination led by the World Health Organization, well-rehearsed, tightly choreographed interventions involving corps of medical professionals that can be drawn from countries who would volunteer. Logistics experts, transport, pharmaceutical, and communications companies, a United Nations-wide response and support from multilateral and private sector financial institutions. If all of these came together, we would be able to protect ourselves even from the worst epidemics. And I just want to remind people that in 1918, the Spanish flu epidemic killed 25 million people in 25 weeks at a time when, of course, air travel was much more limited. An epidemic of that nature, that is that deadly, is almost surely going to happen. The only problem is we don't know exactly when it's going to happen. But I think what we've learned from the Ebola experience is that we are woefully unprepared for an outbreak of that severity. But perhaps the most important element of preparedness is to build strong health systems in every single country. The goal of a strong health system must be to achieve universal health coverage. Everyone must have access to essential services, and poverty must not be a litmus test to qualify for care. We know that investing in health systems is not only an investment in better health, but also in stronger economic growth. Japan has once again been the global leader in promotion of universal health coverage and has worked to ensure access to health care for all. We're proud to have such a close partnership with this country around two concepts that we think hold the key to protecting millions of people and the global economy from the next pandemic: disaster risk management and universal health coverage. We will present much more detail on this pandemic emergency facility in the next few months. And for the reasons I've stated, we'll be drawing on Japan's experience in preparing for disasters and also in providing universal health coverage. The accumulated wisdom in Japan around these two issues has shown the world that taking the proper precautions can save thousands of lives as well as billions of dollars in lost economic growth. It can also be a critical part of our efforts to end extreme poverty. Thank you very much, and I'll now take your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is James Sims, member of PAC. And before I forget, if you have your cell phones, if you could put them on manner mode or turn them off. Anyway, we'd like to go to questions. If you could just state your name and affiliation and keep it to one question. Anthony.
Anthony Rowley, Singapore Business Times. Mr. President, my question is not related to disasters, but as you probably know, today or yesterday, the United Kingdom announced that it would become the first Western country to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I'd like you to comment, if you could, on the role of the bank as you see it and how the World Bank can cooperate with it. And do you not think the very fact that this AIIB has come into existence does not illustrate the inadequate contribution being made by the World Bank and regional development banks to infrastructure building? And do you think there's a case for boosting the World Bank capital to allow it to do that?
Thanks very much. You know, this is there are many elements of the current discussion around the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a very political discussion, but also one that really has to focus on what is the situation today in terms of the need for investment in infrastructure. So just to give you some basic data, 1.4 billion people in the world don't have access to electricity. 2.5 billion people don't have access to basic sanitation services. So the need for infrastructure is enormous. The world spends about $1 trillion a year on infrastructure, but the vast majority of that goes to the developed countries. And so in emerging markets and low-income countries, in just emerging market and low-income countries, there is a $1 to $1.5 trillion deficit in infrastructure spending. Now, in periods of record low interest rates, capital flows to emerging markets were relatively strong. But as the specter of rising interest rates in the U.S. It gets closer, And as inevitably interest rates over time, we don't know exactly when, will go up, capital flows to emerging markets and low-income countries is going to be an even greater challenge. And so there is a huge need for a focus on infrastructure. All of the multilateral development banks together make up about 5 to 10% of the overall annual spending in infrastructure. So from the perspective simply of the need for more infrastructure spending, there's no doubt that from our perspective, we welcome the entry of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and we also welcome the entry of the new development bank, which was formerly called the BRICS Bank. And again, we welcome it because of the extraordinary need for infrastructure. Now, I think what every multilateral development bank will tell you is that infrastructure projects are not simple. They often are very controversial, and because of that, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in preparing these infrastructure projects. So let me list some of the complexities. First of all, if you want to bring if you want to bring funding from existing financial institutions, pension funds, private sector investors, you've got to make projects, you've got to put together projects that are actually bankable. There has to be a return. There has to be relatively low risk. So the preparation of these projects is a huge challenge. Then when you start moving everything from procurement to monitoring, to ensuring that the environmental and social safeguards are respected. All of these things make projects in developing countries very, very difficult. So our perspective is we welcome the entry of these new banks. We're actually in constant discussions with them, trying to help them with some of these issues. We've actually just put together, along with the other multilateral development banks, something we call the Global Infrastructure Facility that 16 of the largest financial institutions in the world that control trillions of dollars in capital have signed on. The multilateral development banks have signed on. Many countries have also signed on. And what we hope to do is to use our 70 years of experience in project preparation and with safeguards, et cetera, to prepare projects that then people will feel comfortable investing in because the risk-reward ratios are clear, and these become good, strong investments, for example, for even the most conservative pension fund. Now, we're not yet sure what exactly the Articles of Agreement of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank will look like, because those discussions have not happened yet. But my suspicion is, as the UK just announced today, they're in their statement, they were very clear in saying that they were going to insist that the standards of any new bank that they are part of would be equal to the World Banks and the Asian Development Banks. And so, as to the question of a capital increase, we do have adequate capital right now, but our intention is to grow our business and grow our business rapidly over the next few years. At a time when demand for our services outstrips our ability to provide capital, then I think a discussion of capital increase is appropriate. But let me assure you, China is still very much working with us. In fact, their borrowing from us will go up over the next few years. While the Chinese government doesn't necessarily need our capital, we have focused intensively on providing state-of-the-art knowledge, state-of-the-art solutions, meaning because we work in so many countries and because we have so many technical experts, any problem that China may be facing or that India may be facing, the two largest countries in the world, our goal is to be able to provide absolutely the best knowledge support services of any organization in the world. In other words, if there's anything in the world that is innovative and helpful in improving water supplies, we will bring it to every country that we work with. So it's a great question. I think more than anything else, the rise of these banks, I think, really shines a hot light on the desperate need for more financing for infrastructure in emerging markets.
And any other questions from the working press? Actually, is that a hand, or actually I have a follow-up or two. I guess one would be, I mean, that begs the question, I mean, do you think that the multilateral development banks, that their current standards are adequate, or do you think that there's some room for improvement in terms of both environmental impact and also sort of social impact, including like indigenous peoples?
Yeah. Well, we're undergoing a process right now where we're revising our safeguards. When we started, when we first implemented safeguards, 20 plus years ago, ours were the first ones in the business. But we've now recognized that we've gotten a little bit behind. So we're revising and strengthening our safeguards, and it's a constant discussion. We've had the most exhaustive consultation process with indigenous groups, with civil society, with NGOs from all over the world. And one of the things you learn is that there are dramatically different views on some of the most sensitive issues across continents, across groups. So, for example, on indigenous people, we've had a very strong indigenous peoples policy, and we will continue to. But you can imagine in countries like Rwanda, where it is illegal to talk about ethnicity, given the history of the genocide in 1994, that it's very difficult for them to deal with a policy that forces one to determine who is indigenous and who is not. Right? So we're working on it, and I would just say that with safeguards and with anything that you try to do on a multilateral basis, multilateralism is complicated. It's always complicated because you've got all of the conflicts in the world that exist today sitting on your board. Certainly we do. So, the good news for me, and I think for the world, is that the board members who represent countries that are often in deep conflict come to the World Bank board and sit down and try to be very constructive so that we can get about the business of trying to end extreme poverty. But you do in fact see all the conflicts in the world sitting together at your board, trying to do things that are as complex as building bridges, building dams, building roads, while at the same time respecting the rights of people who may live in the area. It's a complicated business, and I know that all the new banks will learn very, very quickly just how complicated it is.
Okay. Dennis.
Dennis Normile of Science magazine. I'd like to ask a bit more about the pandemic response facility. What is going to be the role of the World Bank and the role of other international organizations such as WHO and the UN? And what is the status of planning for this facility? And one thing, having covered some outbreaks, you said you're never quite sure where a pandemic or an epidemic is going to break out. Right. You're also never sure what kind of an epidemic it's going to be. There were a lot of plans made to deal with H5N2, H5N1, and they came to nothing. How are you going to maintain flexibility to respond to different types of epidemics?
It's a great question. And since you're from science, you may know I'm also trained in infectious disease, so let me get a little nerdy on you here. The variety of the microbial threats is so broad that the response capacity has to be both extremely flexible to deal with any kind of different outbreak, but it also has to have a sense of scale. Something like the Spanish flu we're not even prepared right now, even after all the work that's been done after Ebola, to deal with something like this. And so here's my sense of how the response will work. First, we've really got to build up WHO capacity. And there's no question that capacity for outbreak alert and response decreased dramatically over the past 5 to 10 years at the World Health Organization. And this was after the Institute of Medicine report said that we're in terrible shape. There should be a $100 million facility. We need to bolster the World Health Organization. The ministers of health of the world, as part of the World Health Assembly, voted against doing that, establishing a fund and trying to build more capacity. So now we know. And now everyone realizes that the World Health Organization has to be at the center of the response. They're the ones who've got the outbreak alert networks. They're networked with all of the ministers of health, so they have to be very strong. Now, if we had enough money at WHO, I think that we could have put out the Ebola response, the Ebola epidemic, much earlier. And so, for the vast majority of the epidemics, the World Health Organization plus a few partners will probably be able to get them under control. But it's the big ones, and Ebola turned out to be one of the big ones, that will require all hands on board and will require rapidly dispersing financing tools. So let's say a huge epidemic breaks out. Here's how I would see it happening. Local health systems would be actively monitoring for outbreaks that are local. This would all be feeding into the WHO. Then when it started growing and crossing borders, the WHO would send out a signal. We would bring in the reinsurance companies. Now, I think the great value of bringing in the reinsurance companies is it's good to have a private sector eyes on this, because these companies literally hold the risk of pandemics in their hands through their business disruption insurance policies. In other words, if businesses get disrupted for whatever reason and they lose income, the reinsurance industry has to pay. So for them, having a 6-hour response window capacity versus a 6-month response window capacity has huge implications for their business. And they also are constantly assessing our level of preparedness. We think getting the private sector to the table so that the actual risk that people hold is sitting at the table is very important. Then you have to have lots of other UN agencies as well. The World Food Program is the best in the world in the public sector at moving things. So in terms of transport, they're extremely good, so they will play an important role. On the community basis, in dealing with women and children, UNICEF is the best in the world. So every one of the UN agencies will have a very specific role, and all of this will be worked out ahead of time. There has to be a large reserve corps of doctors, nurses, who have experience in responding to epidemics. They won't be needed all the time, but I think we need to do, on a regular basis, exercises, simulations, to keep ourselves prepared for when the big events happen. And then we've got to get the private sector, transport companies, DHL, FedEx, all the great transport companies, the drug industry, of course. We need to have them ready to produce vaccines and medicines very, very quickly, and even to help each other produce the vaccines and the medicine that happen to be effective for any particular outbreak. And we hope there is some. There may not be. We also have to think about creating an advanced market signal so that drug manufacturers will be more interested in trying to develop the vaccines and drugs that would help in situations like this. Finally, in just pure logistics, I was sitting with the CEO of Vodafone at a meeting, and he said to me, "Why didn't you guys call us in the middle of the Ebola outbreak? Because we have cell phone capacity in a suitcase that we could have just given to you." But we had not pre-negotiated that relationship, so Vodafone wasn't called in to help us establish in communications, and we lost that opportunity. So we will negotiate all those things ahead of time. If we can handle it with a couple $100 million and a rapidly dispersing instrument, that's great. But we're also going to build in contingent mechanisms that will be much larger, billions of dollars if needed, for vaccine production, for example. If there is an effective vaccine, we need to pre-negotiate the indemnity that the drug companies will need if they're in a situation of rapidly producing perhaps experimental vaccines that might be helpful. And those indemnity mechanisms, it took us months to do that when GlaxoSmithKline offered to provide a potentially useful vaccine, literally free of charge. We had not pre-negotiated the indemnity for them, and so that was delayed as well. So these are many, many different pieces, and every time before, what's happened is that when an outbreak happened, everyone paid attention, it was on the front page, and everyone says, oh my God, why aren't we better prepared? And then when the epidemic left the front pages, everyone forgot. So I think what's different now is that many of us have committed to not letting the world forget. And it's just an accident of history that I happen to be an infectious disease doctor, and I happen to meet with ministers of finance on a regular basis. And I think the argument that will ultimately bring us to a much more robust capability is to bring the financial argument in. If, in fact, pandemics are the #1 risk, according to the insurance industry, why on earth don't we have financing mechanisms, response mechanisms that are equal to the risk? We essentially say pandemics are the largest risk, and then we have a response capacity that appears as if we have completely ignored that risk. So from here on out, I have pledged to my own teams and to our governors that I am going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing until we have a response capacity equal to the challenge that will not only protect potentially millions of people, but will protect the global economy from a clear downside risk that is almost surely going to happen. We just don't know when it's going to happen. Sorry for the long answer, but I just want you to know that these conversations are happening right now. They're happening at the World Health Organization. They're happening at the Institute of Medicine. There's a bunch of us who really are focused on bringing this to reality. We've just met with. I just was at a meeting with Chancellor Merkel. She's very interested in putting it on the agenda for the G7. The government of Turkey has put it on the agenda for the G20. This time we will not forget. This time we'll actually build it.
Sorry, are there any other questions from the working press? Oh.
I'm Kyoko Hasegawa with AFP. Mr. President, you said the disaster risk reduction is closely related to reduction in poverty. Are you going to set the numerical goals as well in the Sendai conferences? And if so, what kind of numerical goals are you thinking about? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think there's any specific numerical goals, but let me give you some sense of how all of this is fitting in. 2015 is probably the most important year for global development in a very long time. The Millennium Development Goals are expiring. The Sustainable Development Goals will be established at the UN General Assembly. And then we also have the Conference of the Parties, the climate change meeting in Paris in December. So one of the things we're trying to do is to really broaden our sense of all the resources available to tackle what's going to be a huge new agenda. The Sustainable Development Goals are 17 goals and 169 targets. There's something for everyone in those goals. And we think it looks like a potentially multi-trillion-dollar agenda if you put it all together. And so one of the things we're doing is beginning to step back and say, so what are all the potential sources of financing for these huge goals? And we want to get right down to the brass tacks, get to the real possibilities, and of course. There's official development assistance, which is important, and some countries have communicated that they're going to increase their official development assistance. But I don't think we're going to see a huge increase in official development assistance. So we're now undergoing an exercise with the IMF and all the other multilateral development banks with the UN, and we're trying to identify all the potential sources of development finance. So you start with improving domestic revenue collection. I mean, we think that developing countries can get a lot better at improving their ability to collect taxes. Second is things like removal of fossil fuel subsidies, at $500 billion at least on fossil fuel subsidies. A huge percentage of that, of course, is in the emerging markets. And if they were to simply get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, which are not helpful to the poor. In fact, these are essentially regressive taxes because they help the top 20% 6 times more than they help the bottom 20%. So it's really not a program aimed at helping the poorest. So getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies is good for climate change. It's good for increasing resources for development. And then you have official development assistance, you have loans like we provide, you have public-private partnerships, and you have pure private sector interventions. And so we're going to put all this together. Now, the one real number that we have to be aware of is that the developed countries promised $100 billion a year for climate financing. And so going into the COP21 meeting in Paris, we have to find where that $100 billion a year is going to come from. Now, I think if we put all these different sources together and get a little bit more creative, I think we can find it, but there's work to do. So all this to say that the only real target for climate financing right now, generally speaking, and disaster risk management is part of it, it's part of adaptation to climate change, is $100 billion. I don't think we're going to set any very specific target for disaster risk management, not one that I know of, but this is a complicated year, and we're going to be talking about development financing a lot, over the next 9 months.
I think, Anthony, you have a follow-up?
If I may say so, your dedication to health issues is highly admirable, but is the World Bank really the best agency to tackle these issues? I mean, it was founded as an infrastructure bank, basically, and it has taken on so many tasks over the years. Is there not a case for stripping some of these functions out and putting them into specialized agencies, leaving the bank to focus more on its core mission?
Well, in this particular case, the part of let me step back. So, why is it important for the World Bank to focus on health? Well, Larry Summers and colleagues about a year and a half ago now published a paper in The Lancet that showed that in low and middle income countries, fully 24% of growth in full income in low and middle income countries was the result of better health outcomes. So 24%. So in other words, Professor Summers has been going around the world now saying it's just a no-brainer. Investing in better health outcomes is really important for economic growth. And so I happen to be really focused on pandemic preparedness because I think the missing piece of all of this has been financing. And I also think that what can drive us to have a much stronger response capacity that will, in fact, protect the world and the global economy from this well-known, highly feared downside risk is for the financial people to get involved. If we leave this just to the specialized health agencies, then they're not going to be able to make the argument that the reason we do this is not only because we need to protect human health, but it's also part of building buffers and resilience in protecting the global economy from downside risk. That is part of our job. We have the IMF when we have financial crises, and the question we were asking is, why don't we have something when pandemics hit? Why aren't we better prepared? So we are not doing the the part of this work that's related to detecting outbreaks or doing the molecular genetics of particular strains. We don't do that at all. But we also very strongly feel that if the financial people are not involved, if the ministers of finance of the world do not understand that in investing in this response capacity, you're really investing in resilience of the global economic system, we will fail again. So that is specifically what I'm focused on. And I think that that's what's new. When I was working mostly in the health area, our biggest problem was we couldn't maintain the attention of the ministers of finance long enough to actually build appropriate, effective, adequate systems. And now they kind of have to listen to me.
Okay. Oh, are you working press? Okay. Please.
日刊現代の小畑と申します。キム総裁は9日に、ワシントンで原発に対する援助は行わないと話しました。ところが日本の福島原発事故はまだ続いています。改めて原発政策に対する考えを教えてください。よろしくお願いします。
Well, we don't. At the World Bank Group, we do not invest in nuclear power. We don't have expertise in it. We think that the questions of safety and well, the unknowns still, because we don't have any expertise in this, we don't invest in it. In just about everything else that we invest in, we actually do have in-house expertise, and we have no plans to develop expertise in the nuclear area. Having said that, though, I think that there is a huge demand for increased capacity in every country in the world to have more energy that's cleaner. And so one of the things that we've been really focusing on at the World Bank Group is trying to find a global agreement on carbon pricing. At the UN General Assembly in 2014, we sponsored a statement in which we tried to get as many countries as we could to sign on, in which we called for a system of carbon pricing, a global system of carbon pricing. And to our surprise, really, we had no idea how many people would sign on. Countries representing 52% of global GDP, more than 1,000 companies, and since then, many, many more governments and companies have signed on to this statement on carbon pricing. And here's why I say that. I think that, that there is the potential of much better technology for nuclear energy. I think that many of the nuclear power plants today are still using very old technology. And the reason we're so focused on carbon pricing is that with carbon pricing, we think that the incentives for going much more quickly in developing cleaner ways of generating energy will be set in motion. There's no question that putting carbon into the air actually has a cost, but we are not capturing that cost, and we are not creating the right kinds of incentives through a system that would actually realistically capture the cost of putting carbon in the air. So our position is that while we're not going to get into nuclear energy now, we need to set the conditions so that the incentives are aligned for much more rapid technological development in solar, in concentrated solar, in storage capacity, in nuclear, in geothermal. We also think that there's an extremely important role still for hydroelectric power. In Africa, less than 1% of potential hydroelectric sources are utilized, whereas in developed countries, 60% of potential hydroelectric power sources are exploited. So we don't do it now. We don't have any plans on doing it. But if we get a price on carbon, our hope is that the technology will expand so rapidly that we could take another look at it.
Any other questions? If not, I have one follow-up then. I mean, regarding issues like infrastructure and also sort of disaster resiliency, I recently read a paper that was talking about the survivors up in Tohoku, and one of the main factors that contributed to their survival wasn't necessarily the height of the tsunami wall, but it was their social capital. Basically their linkages and how well integrated they were into the community. Now, I was wondering, in terms of what the World Bank does, I mean, do you look at things like that, or is it more sort of these sort of harder areas?
Well, I encourage everyone to read our World Development Report from 2015. And the World Development Report in 2015, and this has a lot to do with the fact that that I'm an anthropologist, not an economist. In addition to being a medical doctor, I'm also an anthropologist. And so we, for the first time in our history, in this World Development Report, we looked at behavioral economics. In the title of the volume is Mind, Behavior, and Society. And it built a lot on the work of Daniel Kahneman, who argued that, quite contrary to the classic economic assumption that people think on the basis of incentives and rationality, that people think automatically, that people think according to mental models, that people think according to the people around them, social norms. And so we actually looked at that carefully, and both from the perspective of can we utilize these insights in improving outcomes in development, and can we use these insights to be self-critical, to look at the extent to which we use mental models and automatic thinking and social thinking, and explore our own biases. Now, let me go then right to Ebola, because it matters there too. So survival in Ebola. Probably, I think the final analysis is going to be that the most important part of bringing these epidemics more under control was changes in behavior. And what we saw was that when the behavioral recommendations came from the government, or even from international organizations, there was enormous suspicion. And when the messages could be localized, and you had local community leaders delivering these messages, the uptake was much, much higher. So UNICEF brilliantly focused specifically on utilizing their community-based networks to get the messages out. And I think what we're going to find, we haven't done the analysis yet. I think what we're going to find is that the more these social networks existed, the more quickly the behavior actually changed. So we take this extremely seriously, and of course, as you can imagine, as an anthropologist, it's very interesting for me to think that in addition to just building, roads and dams and things that we need to do anyway, that by taking advantage of what we now know from behavioral economics, we can actually improve the outcomes of programs, we can improve the design of programs, and we can prevent ourselves from thinking automatically and bringing too many of our own biases into the work we do.
I'd like to, okay, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ken Moritsugu from the Associated Press. In the area of climate financing, Japan has been funding some high-efficiency coal power plants in places like Indonesia, somewhat controversially. The argument that the Japanese government makes is that that these countries need energy, and if we didn't fund these plants, they would probably build plants that are even more polluting and would produce even more carbon. Do you agree with that line of thinking?
Well, we've made a pretty clear statement in our energy policy that we're going to try to avoid coal as much as possible. Now, again, it goes back to carbon pricing, because right now there's not a real economic argument to be made for carbon capture and storage, but the technology has been growing in fits and starts, but there hasn't been a real strong driving force to bring these new technologies online. Is it possible someday that coal-fired plants could be extremely efficient to the point of actually capturing a huge proportion of the carbon and putting it into the ground? I see that possibility, but for now, carbon emissions from coal are quite a bit higher than even natural gas. Now, we know that fossil fuels are going to be part of the energy future. There's going to be a transition. But our focus right now is on doing everything we can to tackle climate change with 5 very clear priorities. And the first being carbon pricing, second being removing fossil fuel subsidies, which are both regressive and polluting, building cleaner, more livable cities, investing in what we call climate-smart agriculture, and finally just dramatically increasing financing for renewables. That's our strategy. But there's going to be places where if a country has no other option but to, for example, clean up an extremely dirty coal-fired plant like in Kosovo. We're looking at this right now, and there's no other option but for us to help finance. We're going to look at it because I think the first priority still has to be providing the poorest people with energy. And again, we're going to avoid coal in every possible situation if we can, but I think you have to look at the energy mix question from this broader perspective. We need better technology, and I think the best way to both take carbon out of the air and spur the right kind of technological development is through carbon pricing.
Any more questions? I don't know, do we have time for one more?
Sure.
Okay. If there are none from the working press, if any of the associate members would like to ask a question, if not. Okay.
Probably going to get some calls from like the Kentucky Center.
日本語で失礼します。2015年は、国際開発ジャーナル社の吉岡と申します。はい。2015年は、ミレニアム開発目標達成期限を迎えますが、新たに、策定作業が進んでいる、持続可能な開発目標について、世界銀行として何かコメントいただけますでしょうか。
Yeah, so when there are the Secretary General Pan Ki-moon has done, I think, a really incredible job of coming up with a consensus document. So the developed countries, all of the G77 countries have now agreed on this list. But if you look at the list, 17 goals and 169 targets is a lot. And it's a lot for anyone to keep in their head. I mean, I at one point could tell you what the 8 Millennium Development Goals were, but it's going to be harder to keep 17, I think, in your head. So, first of all, I think it's really important that every single country, all of the United Nations, have now embraced this particular set of goals. I think the real question will be, so how do we then take this long list and turn it into some kind of movement that can spur action? Because that did happen with the Millennium Development Goals. Now, the Millennium Development Goals, were focused and were clear, but they didn't have that kind of buy-in from all of the member states. And also, the Millennium Development Goals were more focused on how to divide up official development assistance, foreign aid. These goals now are forcing us to think much more broadly. And for example, we think the private sector has to be at the table because they're going to be responsible for and expected to contribute to a huge part of these sustainable development goals. So I think it was a great process, but now between now and the UN General Assembly, we've got to think about tactics and strategy and how we can use these goals to spur really more focused, more effective action around these goals. And I am waiting to see what happens. It'll be very interesting to watch.
Okay, I think we've actually hit exactly 4 p.m., which is our allotted time per day, and it doesn't look like there are any more questions, so I would like to thank again our speaker today for the very far-ranging topics that he was able to discuss. And as is our usual custom, we would like to give him an honorary membership. And so I know he gets to Tokyo actually more often than we know, so hopefully we will see him at the club at another point.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.